Reading League for Chapter Virginia event. As we're letting people in, if you want to post in the chat your name and where you're from and maybe what your role is with literacy, that'd be great so we could all get to know each other a little bit. One of the things we hope that happens through the Reading League, our Virginia chapter, is that we get to network with people that maybe are near us or have things that are similar so that we could build a system of networking as well. Welcome, Jenny from Illinois. Welcome to everyone. All right. Again, just as you're coming in, if you want to post in the chat your name and where you're from and what you do, again, just so that we can get a sense of who's in the audience and if there's any opportunities to network, that'd be wonderful. Great, seeing a lot of teachers. So we all had well, some of you may have had a long Monday, but if you're on spring break, you may have had a very beautiful Monday. In Virginia, we're all having spring breaks usually either this week or next week. So welcome to everyone. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to everyone joining us tonight. I'm Susan Campbell, president of the Reading League, the Virginia chapter. So we welcome you. We're thrilled to have you here joining us tonight. We're also honored and thrilled to have with us from the National Center for Improving Literacy, Deborah Lynam, and she's here to enhance our understanding of dyslexia. Before we begin tonight's event, I just want to let everyone know that the event is being recorded. The recording will be posted to our website in the next few days. We look forward to an active chat tonight, so please feel free to post your thoughts or comments in the chat. We'll monitor the chat for questions and try to address those questions either throughout the evening or at the end of the event. All right. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you just a little bit about the Reading League Virginia. Our board is made up of 11 members. We're all volunteers from across different regions across the Commonwealth, and we all have different roles. And so we're very happy to be able to support the mission and our TRL-VA work. Our vision is that we want every educator to be prepared to implement evidence-based practices to meet the diverse profiles of all students with the goal of becoming skilled and lifelong readers. We also want them to have all the literacy skills they need to be successful lifelong readers and learners. You can take a moment to scan our mission. And our goal for tonight is to help enhance your knowledge of recognizing the signs of dyslexia and delivering effective reading instruction to students with dyslexia. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we officially start, I want to thank Julia Kohler, our events committee chair, and the members of her committee for bringing us tonight's event. Thank you very much, Julia, and to the work of your committee. Now I'll turn it over to Julia so that we can begin.
Thank you, Susan. Good evening, everyone. I just want to take a moment to introduce our presenter, Deborah Lynam. She is joining us from New Jersey. She works with NCIL and also with the New Jersey Department of Education. And she is also a board member of the Reading League in her state. And so we are very excited to have her here to share with us about understanding dyslexia.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to join you tonight for the National Center on Improving Literacy's webinar, Understanding Dyslexia. Thank you for that introduction. I also just like to share when I do these events is that I'm also a parent, and I have 3 adult boys at this point, and 2 of them are dyslexic. And I have spent the better part of their young lives navigating special education services and intervention services. So I come to this with a passion. This is one of my favorite topics to really work on with educators and families. So if you're not already familiar, the National Center on Improving Literacy is a federally funded national comprehensive center. It was established through the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, in the fall of 2016. And it's jointly administered by the Office of Special Education Programs and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. It's really a partnership among literacy experts, university researchers, and technical assistance providers. Specifically, the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon, the Florida Center of Reading Research at Florida State University, and the RMC Research Corporation. So for tonight's presentation, we're going to be utilizing the chat box quite a bit to have some interaction. I kind of have already seen some of your introductions in the chat box, but what I'd like to do now is take a moment and look at these bulleted lists here of your role in attending tonight. Take a few moments. We're going to do a waterfall chat. If you've never participated in these before, what we're going to do is I'm going to pose you questions throughout tonight's event, give you a minute to kind of review the answers. And then when I say 1, 2, 3, waterfall chat, everyone should be pressing submit on the answers that they've populated in the chat box. And what we're going to see is a really fast cascade of all of the answers. And I believe Julia said she's going to monitor this for me, and she will be verbally kind of giving me some of the responses that are coming in. So let's practice with this one. Even though you've already put in some of your introductory information into the chat, let's try it in waterfall format. So joining us tonight, who's here? Let me know. Are you a K-3 classroom teacher? Are you a parent? Are you a principal? Get that typed into the chat box. So send it out to the whole group. And when I say 1, 2, 3, we're going to submit. Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1, chat waterfall.
So lots of reading specialists, lots of special education staff. We have parents. We have secondary.
Ooh, excellent. All right, great. So now you get the flow of how that's going to work. We're going to have a couple of more participatory activities that'll follow the same waterfall chat format. So NCIL's hope tonight is that you are going to leave with an increased understanding of the common definitions of dyslexia, as well as what the underlying causes of dyslexia are, and then some of the effects that dyslexia may be having on the students or the children in your lives in terms of their literacy development. Tonight's session is really based on information that's found in this resource on NCIL's website. It's called the Understanding Dyslexia Implementation Toolkit. And right now, I'm actually going to put this link into the chat for you. Make sure it's going out to everybody. Okay. I believe you're also going to get this information in a follow-up email after tonight's session. But if you want to take a look at it now, you can check out this information and everything that we're going to be talking about in the presentation tonight. Even if I'm referencing a handout or some type of other resource, it's going to be something that you can find on this website, most likely in this implementation toolkit. So to get started, throughout the session tonight, you're going to be hearing from Julianne Masser. Julianne is a graduate student in school psychology at the University of Oregon, and she's going to be sharing some of her own personal experiences as an individual with dyslexia. Many students experience difficulties similar to those described by Julianne when they're first learning to read. In fact, the International Dyslexia Association indicates that somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population, that's about 1 in 5 people, are experiencing symptoms associated with dyslexia. Now, if you're more familiar with research literature, we know that prevalence rates indicated in that literature may actually be a little bit lower. Sometimes we're seeing more 10, 12%. But Julianne's going to be talking about some very common kind of symptoms that we see for kids in the classroom. So listen now to Julianne sharing a little bit more.
I'm Julianne Masser. I'm 26 years old. I currently attend the University of Oregon School Psychology PhD program, and I'm a member of the team at the National Center on Improving Literacy. I have a strong interest in early literacy instruction and assessment, and I'm passionate about teaching students to read. Honestly, when I think back to my early experiences learning to read, I don't have a lot of positive memories. What comes to mind is a lot of frustration, a lot of tears, and just exasperation at struggling to learn to read. I just remember feeling frustrated that other kids were clearly easily learning to read and I wasn't. And although I remember educators being passionate and caring deeply about me and trying to support me, I also remember them seeming a bit lost, not understanding why I was struggling, and seeing my frustration and sadness and recognizing that they needed to do something to help me, but not exactly feeling like they knew how.
Okay, so here's our first waterfall question. How many individuals have you encountered who have had a similar experience to Julianne? So your answers could be none, some, or many. So you can get those typed into the chat box. And when I say waterfall chat, we'll enter them all. Okay, 3, 2, 1, chat waterfall. I think I got a glimpse of that one, Julia. Lots of manys there.
Lots of nannies.
That's great. That's great. All right, one more question. So out of those manys and some, does your school have a plan in place to help students like Julianne? If you put in a 1, it'll mean that you have a solid plan in place at your school. A 2 would mean you're kind of working on it, figuring things out. And 3 would be you have no plan at all, and you're here tonight because you recognize you really need some help. So let's get your questions into the chat, and then when I say chat waterfall, we'll enter them all. Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1, chat waterfall. All right, I don't know. I didn't see a ton of 3s there, couple, but mostly 1s and 2s, which is nice to see. Excellent. So to better understand the experiences of students with dyslexia, like Julianne here, we need to kind of have this understanding of what dyslexia is, right? Because it can be confusing, and I would say I've been doing this advocacy work for well over a decade at this point. I know things have improved. Talking about dyslexia 10 years ago, there was much more confusion than what is happening now. But it is important to understand that there may still be some confusion out there because there's not really one universal definition of dyslexia across different stakeholder groups. And the list that you're seeing here of these different logos for the National Institute of Health, International Dyslexia Association, Mayo Clinic, etc., that's not even a comprehensive list. Like there are other places that have a little bit alternate definitions of things. But what you're seeing here on the screen is actually the definition of dyslexia that is now found in the Code of Virginia. So is there anybody that would be brave enough to unmute themselves and read this Virginia definition for us? Just let us know in the chat if you would be willing to unmute yourself and read that definition. If not, I'm going to ask you, Julia, if you'll do it for us.
Sure. So dyslexia is distinguished from other learning disabilities due to its weakness occurring at the phonological level. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So there may be times where you hear some experts talking about this idea of unexpectedness in relationship to intellectual ability, so like IQ. I just like to always make it clear that if you read that definition carefully, that idea of unexpectedness came into play in terms of, right, unexpected in relationship to other cognitive abilities. So that's not necessarily saying that there has to be a discrepancy between the student's IQ and their reading performance. I just always feel it's important to point that out because it could become really problematic if you are requiring that there be some types of like standardized discrepancy between IQ and what would be considered unexpectedness. So just kind of a little nuance there to that definition. And Julianne kind of did a really nice job of explaining to us that this unexpected difficulty can be confusing and frustrating for both students themselves as well as their parents and their teachers, because these might be students who are experiencing success in other academic areas or in other areas of their life. And then they feel like reading should be coming easy to them. And then their families and their educators might just feel like they're at a loss when we see that they actually need so much support in their reading development. It can be quite confusing. So it's commonly accepted that dyslexia is brain-based, meaning that there are certain brain regions that are important for reading, and these may develop or function differently in students with dyslexia. And it's specifically these areas or differences in the brain tend to be in areas that are linked to reading and language, primarily in the left hemisphere of the brain. So one issue is we think about, dyslexia is a learning disability that affects word reading skills. And these skills include phonological processing, which has to do with manipulating the individual sounds that we hear in words or sounds that form words, portions and connections of sounds that form words. It could impact rapid visual verbal responding or the ability to quickly recognize printed letters and words, and then also impact spelling. So because of these kinds of difficulties, reading words is often a slow and really deliberate process for kids with dyslexia. And it's this slow and deliberate process which can really interfere with their efforts to kind of understand what they're reading. So much energy is putting into like figuring this stuff out. So, one common misconception is that all students with dyslexia are demonstrating the same exact problems with reading. And really what we know is that dyslexia exists on a continuum from mild symptoms to really profound reading difficulties. And much like students who may be diagnosed with attention problems like ADHD in the classroom, those students often kind of experience different levels of difficulty in paying attention. It's the same when it comes to dyslexia. So the reading profiles of children diagnosed with dyslexia don't all look the same. So we may see, most students may be diagnosed and have these difficulties with learning sound-letter relationships that support successful decoding, but their overall profile of reading-related skills may actually vary, even though there's this kind of common thread with the decoding piece. And it's because of this that students are going to demonstrate different levels of difficulty. So if students kind of have mild mild letter sound correspondence difficulties, we may see that they're able to kind of pick up on other skills and move along. But if those are really profound and so much of their mental energy is going into that type of work, we could start to see some of those other difficulties that Julia was reading about in the definition, like related to comprehension and vocabulary development and background knowledge growth. All of those could really start to become pretty significant problems too. So students with dyslexia could actually have pretty strong skills in other non-reading related cognitive areas, maybe like retaining information or seeing connections between things. So even though we know these reading related problems or challenges might exist for them throughout their life, like really persist for them, dyslexia, it's really important to understand like the reading part of it can be successfully academically accounted for. And as we move into our adult lives, it can be professionally kind of accommodated for when needed. So, you know, if we're thinking about like a life outcome, we should feel really secure that we can put good supports in place to resolve some of these academic issues that are happening. And then we will put accommodations in place as needed to support kids over the course of their academic career and professional lives. So now that we've sort of covered what dyslexia is, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm happy to take them as we go, or we can hold them to the end. We're going to move on to another, part of our presentation tonight about the causes of dyslexia. So in this section, we're going to check in with experts, and we're going to discuss some more of the myths about what causes dyslexia. While we don't really know for sure what causes this condition, brain imaging studies have demonstrated that dyslexia is a brain-based disability. Okay, these studies have shown that on an average, individuals with dyslexia have differences in those brain regions that are associated with language. We kind of talked about that. So specifically, individuals with dyslexia show differences in parts of the brain that are associated with a few tasks, right? So it's manipulating sounds in spoken words, mapping sounds to print, and recognizing words by sight, like instantaneously seeing a word and being able to pronounce that word. So in the picture that you're seeing here on the screen, we see key parts of the brain that are associated with reading. Those kind of tasks that I just talked about. So if you're looking in the frontal lobe area, this area in red on the screen, this is where speech is produced. And this area of the brain is involved with processing speech sounds as we listen to speech and as we try to articulate or produce speech. And then we see this blue area of the brain in the middle here. This is where a written word is kind of segmented into its individual sounds. So this part of the brain works on kind of word analysis work, right? It's mapping letter sounds, and we're using this as we're sounding out words when we're reading. So kind of involved in decoding there. And then we see this green area, the occipital to temporal region, which is in green. And this is where the brain stores the appearance and the meaning of words. Sometimes this part of the brain is called the visual word form area. And this is where letter recognition, word reading automaticity, and also some language comprehension is happening immediately, because the word's spelling, the word's pronunciation, and the word's meaning is becoming really solidified, and it lives in this part of the brain so that when we see it in print, all of that information is kind of connected to that word form. Now look at these two images of the brain. The one on the left is a typical reader, and you'll notice how these critical brain areas that I was just talking about in those colored diagrams, you can see how those are activated during reading or language tasks, and they're activated as illustrated by these kind of yellow and red activation patterns. But look at what's happening on the right with these readers with dyslexia. We see that many portions of the brain that were in that blue and green area are not activated now during the same kind of reading and language activities. So this is when people are talking about the brain-based differences, this is what they're talking about, that those areas of the brain related to language and reading are not as fully engaged and activated in readers who are dyslexic as compared to typically developing readers. Okay, now I am not a neuroscientist, so that was kind of my high level overview for you. I hope it was helpful. But what I want to do right now is we are going to hear from Dr. Guinevere Eden from Georgetown University, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about what we have going on here in dyslexia.
There are differences in the brains of people with dyslexia that we can measure with brain imaging. And it's believed that many of those differences already are present at birth. And other differences may be there because of them not having the same kind of reading experience as a person who doesn't have dyslexia. And we measure these differences primarily with magnetic resonance imaging. And the differences that we see are reflected in the different kinds of analysis we can do with MRI. So we have people inside the scanner do, say, a reading task or a sound deletion task, and we look at how does the activity in the brain differ. And that activity is measured locally in the brain, which areas differ, but also people use the data to look at the amount of correlation across those different areas. So it's a sort of a functional connectivity. And you can take any of these measures and try to incorporate them all together to get a really good understanding of how does the brain in people with dyslexia differ in terms of the anatomy, the function, and as a network, how all these areas fit together. And the areas that we're talking about are mainly areas involved in reading or in skills that we know that support reading. The finding that most people agree on is that when you look at the left hemisphere in studies of groups of people with dyslexia and people who do not have dyslexia, and I emphasize it's really group studies, is that there is differences in the anatomy, primarily in the left hemisphere, in regions that are known to observe language and written language. And that's also where we see differences in activity. So when those participants are doing a task that involves reading or something like manipulating phonemes, they may underactivate those parts of the brain. They're not using them quite to the same level, even though they were actually doing the tasks. They just aren't engaging those areas quite so much, particularly an area in the back of the brain, and the areas around the temporal and parietal cortex that are involved in helping us understand how sounds are made up of how words are made up of sounds and how we map sounds to print, but also an area at the bottom of the temporal lobe that's involved in visual word form recognition. This is an area that we use when we read and we recognize words by sight. It's an area that a skilled reader trains up. It's how we become automatic readers. And that's also one area that's not activated the same way in people who have dyslexia compared to those who do not.
Great. So it's important to note that research into the causes of dyslexia is really still an ongoing area. There's still much that we have to learn about specific causes. For instance, it's not really clear whether those observed brain differences that Dr. Eden was just talking about are actually the cause of reading difficulties associated with dyslexia, or if those differences are actually the result of not learning to read, right? So that there's still stuff that needs to be teased out here. The causes of dyslexia are complex, but what we do know is that there's both sort of something happening at the level of our genes, but then also environmental factors that are playing critical roles, okay? What we really should take away from this discussion of the brain is that the brain differences have been observed at a group level, and Dr. Eden made this point. We are not at a point where we can be using these types of procedures like fMRI to diagnose at an individual level. This is kind of a group level data that's come in, and we can use that to kind of understand things, but this is not something that we're reliably using to diagnose individual children. So now we have our next waterfall. Here's the question. Get yourself ready in the chat and I'll let you know when to post. So is dyslexia, and now we're moving into, I want to kind of test you on your myth. Can you tease out these mythologies happening here? Is dyslexia a reading disorder that's based in vision problems? Okay, you heard myself and Dr. Eden talk about the visual word form area of the brain being kind of implicated in some way. But is dyslexia a reading disorder based in vision problems, which cause individuals to read words backwards or to reverse letters? What do you think? Yes or no? 3, 2, 1, chat waterfall. See, I'm telling you, if I gave this question a decade ago, this was a big myth a decade ago, but you guys, you're good to go. Yeah, so let's see here, veins. So this is a myth, right? It's a pretty common myth and maybe not so common anymore, I have to be honest. So dyslexia is not caused by vision or eye problems. This idea that children are seeing letters backwards or mixing up letters, it really has more to do with kind of how they're processing letters that might look quite similar. So like the B and the D or the P and the B, like there's a very similar shape, and students have problems discriminating between those. And it can also, you know, this is talking about vision, but it can also be a problem discriminating kind of sounds that are produced very similar in the way we talk about words. So like if you watch my mouth and those are two distinct phonemes that would change a word from a fixin or a vixen, right? One sound change, but they're produced so similar into the mouth that students might have difficulties discriminating those. But the thing to know here is that, you know, students may just take more time to learn how to do those discriminations of the visual letter or of the sounds. And that's kind of where the mix-up is coming from. It's really not related to a vision problem or a hearing problem, like taking in sounds and hearing those. So in order to receive a diagnosis of dyslexia, vision problems, probably it's a good idea to rule them out. But vision training or eye exercises or special glasses with colored lenses or paper overlays with different colors, they're really not considered by the American Academy of Pediatrics to have anything really to do with treatment of dyslexia. So it's important, even though we know this is a myth. Sometimes we can get wrapped up in different recommendations that are made for interventions and stuff. So we should really think that through, think about the recommendations being made and if they're really kind of serving more of a vision problem, or is it really getting at the root of what's going on with dyslexia. So now that we've talked about causes and understanding that we actually don't know what the root cause is, we know what's going on, but we don't have a concrete, you know, understanding of what the cause is. Now we're going to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about the effects of dyslexia, right? So it's a language and reading-based disability, and students are often going to be struggling with skills that are linked to language in some way. So even before receiving formal reading instruction in school, children with dyslexia, we might be able to see some of these difficulties showing up in their phonological processing. So for example, they may struggle to hear and produce words that rhyme. They may not really hear or be able to separate the individual sounds in words, or maybe understanding like where a word is defined within a sentence, like that there's a cut point between words in a sentence. Or maybe they will hear a word, but then when they go back to kind of recall it and bring it back to you, kind of the sounds are getting garbled or mixed up or transposed in some way. So there's some kind of issue related to their phonological processing that we can probably even start to see some signs of that before we're even talking about reading and writing instruction. And then as students with dyslexia grow a little bit older, we also start to see this struggle in making connections between the sounds of words and then the printed letters of words, right? So this is usually as reading instruction is introduced, we can start to see these phonological processing problems move from just oral language into problems acquiring written language. So for example, these students typically have difficulty quickly identifying the letter sound or the sounds that map onto printed letters or letter combinations. They may have a hard time blending sounds together to form words. And because of these difficulties, it's often really hard for these students to sound out unfamiliar words that they've not seen before in print. Okay. Students with dyslexia may also have a hard time recognizing familiar words that they've seen many times before. Okay, so this is like a double whammy, right? You've never seen a word before, you don't have good letter sound connections, so even decoding that word becomes a problem. But often we will see, even if you've decoded a word multiple times, you've been working with it, you still may have a problem being able to recognize that word instantaneously, right? So these are challenges reading both familiar and unfamiliar words. And it also typically results in difficulties spelling and then with written expression, right? If you're trying to get your thoughts down on paper, because the types of underlying skills that are involved with spelling and writing are the same types of skills that are involved with decoding and reading. So because their word reading is so effortful, students with dyslexia will be reading texts, and when they're trying to do that independently, most of their cognitive resources are going to be spent on trying to sound out or decode those words. And it really leaves little cognitive energy for gaining meaning while they're reading. So it often kind of results in students looking like they have reading comprehension problems. But if you do a little bit more digging, you'll often see that those difficulties when reading don't always extend into difficulties when they're listening to things. So there's sort of this idea that there's reading comprehension problems, but if you test a little bit to see what the student's listening comprehension looks like, you'll often find that they're fine if a story is read to them or if they're listening to directions or something. But if they have to pull those words off the page themselves, that's when the cognitive overload starts happening, because so much of their attention is going to trying to figure out those letter sound connections and decoding words. So if we see that a student goes unsupported in those reading comprehension in the decoding difficulties, if we see they're not getting any support, what happens over time is their ability to make meaning from text isn't working for them, right? It's not producing new vocabulary, new background knowledge. All of their energy is just trying to read word by word on that page to sound things out. And they're missing a lot of the purpose of all of the texts that they're coming into contact with, that their peers are coming in contact with. So usually what we need to be thinking about is intervening early at the level of some of these word level difficulties so that we can provide good intervention to remediate those skills. And if they are having those comprehension difficulties because of so much energy being used up on sounding out words, we could think about accommodations to support, maybe building off of their strong listening comprehension skills. So maybe books on tape or teacher read alouds, other ways for them to keep moving on their vocabulary and background knowledge and comprehension skills. All right, so we are going to hear from Julianne again. She's going to talk a little bit about word reading difficulties that impact students throughout the school day in a whole host of ways.
I remember in first grade, second grade, when we would do popcorn reading, where you got to call on your friend. You would read a line and then you were supposed to call on your friend and then they were supposed to read aloud. And I remember having sweaty palms anytime we did that activity. I was really having a fight or flight response to having to read out loud because I knew I wouldn't be successful. I knew it would take way longer than I was taking any of my peers. I knew I'd get singled out and I didn't want to do that. And I remember sometimes I would get called on and I would just pretend I didn't know where we were, because I knew that if you pretended that you didn't know where you were in the story, then they'd say, oh, you weren't following along, you don't get to have a turn. And I would say, oh, great, I didn't want a turn. And I wouldn't have to read out loud. So I do remember having that just increasing anxiety about being singled out as someone who couldn't read. I just remember feeling like everyone else is looking at me. Everyone thinks I'm stupid. And no matter what, even all the adults in my life who loved and supported me said that wasn't true, I still felt that way.
Great. So students with dyslexia may demonstrate slower than typical growth in these foundational areas of reading development. And they're typically related to kind of that word reading piece, right? And it could be related to their ability to manipulate sounds in words. This is typically referred to as phonemic awareness. It could also be connected to the ability to map sounds to print in order to read unknown words. And this is typically like the alphabetic principle or letter sound correspondences. So in the next part of our presentation tonight, we're going to kind of go through 3 periods of reading development: preschool years, kindergarten to 1st grade, and a 2nd grade and beyond. Those are kind of nice chunks, like ways to think about reading development. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what typical development looks like, and then what characteristics might be a little bit of a red flag for us to be thinking we might be watching out for dyslexia. So in the preschool years, typical readers are able to notice repeated sounds that are spoken to them orally, such as recognizing the repeated B sound in ba, ba, black sheep. They may also start to pay attention to beginning or rhyming sounds in words. Typical readers also start to know the functions of print because they're working with books and they're interested in them. They may recognize the different types of text. They might recognize that different types of texts are used for different purposes, and they'll start to understand that printed words have meaning, such as noticing that the printed letters on a stop sign, represent the word stop. And they also will start to kind of learn the names of at least like 10 or at least the letters in their name. So they start gaining this understanding that letters have names, right? So they're making those connections. In contrast, students in preschool who may be at risk for dyslexia, they might be having trouble learning common nursery rhymes. There's just not that intuitive feel for the rhyming kind of prosody there. They may have difficulty recognizing rhyming patterns or alliteration, things like that. So they're not as sensitive to those sound structures in words. They may also struggle with learning and naming the letters of the alphabet or the letters in their name. And you may also find that from a language perspective, they are using much simpler language and vocabulary, and their peers are starting to use more complex language in the preschool setting. When we talk about kindergartners and 1st graders, typical readers start to develop an understanding of simple one-to-one letter sound correspondence. For example, they would be knowing that the letter C makes the sound K. They also begin to recognize that speech sounds map onto printed letters to form words. And they're also able to use this knowledge of letter sound correspondences to decode or sound out 1-syllable words with known sound spelling patterns. They'll also start to try to make sense of what they're reading, and they may stop and you'll see them rereading text that's not making sense to them as they're decoding. In contrast, students in kindergarten or 1st grade who may be showing these risk factors, they may not be making those letter sound associations. They may sometimes be making errors while they're reading that show no connection to the sounds of the letters that are there on the page, so kind of like wild guesses. They may read the word cat as kitten because they're trying to use other picture cues to figure out what that word is. Students in these grades may also have difficulty understanding that words can be taken apart, right? That there may be an onset and a rhyme, or there may be individual sounds in words. So this makes decoding unknown words pretty challenging. And because they have these challenges with that mapping piece, you'll see that it's very effortful for them to try to sound out simple words, even like map or cat or pan. Oftentimes, this is around the time frame where kids will start voicing that they don't like reading or reading is hard. Okay, when kids who are picking these things up, they get it. They see those letter sound connections. They get that alphabetic principle. A red flag for dyslexia is like really a challenge to get to that alphabetic principle. And then in second grade and beyond, we have typical readers who can use their knowledge of increasingly complicated letter sound correspondences to sound out a variety of unknown words. They'll use that knowledge of individual sound correspondences, but also word parts or chunks to decode irregular multisyllabic words. So they start to kind of have this sense of syllable patterns or maybe prefixes, suffixes, like the morphemes in words, and they're able to use those. And we see students begin to read more accurately and fluently enough so that they can start using some of their cognitive attention on the comprehension of the text, right? So it's no longer just so much focus on sounding out those words. We start to see kind of a lift into so much more cognitive energy for that comprehension part. Students at risk for dyslexia in these upper grades will likely show that they still have very slow progress in acquiring some of these reading skills. You may see them continue to guess at words rather than trying to sound them out. They may be confusing words that sound alike. And because of these difficulties, just like Julianne was saying, we're going to start to see a lot of students who are really trying to avoid reading out loud. And these students in later grades often show poor spelling and messy handwriting, right? So all of these things really start to become very evident that their peers have moved on and we're still seeing these red flags. People sometimes think that individuals with another common characteristic before we get there is family history. So this is a really important finding, and I once heard a researcher, I believe it was Dr. Gobb, Dr. Nadine Gobb, say asking on a kindergarten readiness kind of tool coming in, asking families if there's a history of dyslexia or reading difficulties or learning difficulties is a really, really great practice because the hereditary nature of dyslexia is really strong, and it would be very, very important to understand this about our families. So children who are, showing these symptoms of dyslexia, if they are in families where these types of brain differences, right, are also present, they are very likely to have similar reading difficulties. So when considering whether a student may be at risk, really important to talk to the family. And there are different kind of checklists and things that you can access through NCIL or through other online resources that could give you kind of nice ideas about how to ask these questions of families. All right, now moving on to another myth. So people sometimes think that individuals with dyslexia will not be able to learn to read. And it is true that without appropriate intervention supports, it is highly likely that they're going to continue to demonstrate profound reading difficulties. However, there is decades of educational research that have shown that these students can develop the reading skills that they need. And in some cases, they may be able to catch up to their peers when they receive timely, explicit, and systematic reading instruction. So schools can support reading development of students by having good systems of universal screening of dyslexia risk in place, identifying those children who show those red flags, and then providing high quality evidence-based core instruction, supplemental interventions, and then intensive supports for students who are not progressing even after we're putting increasing levels of intensity in place for them. With high quality evidence-based reading instruction in place, students become readers and can be just as successful as their peers. So let's hear a little bit more from Julianne on that.
Getting a diagnosis of dyslexia was empowering, knowing that I was different and I just learned differently and that this was impacting me. But I wasn't stupid and I had a lot of other strengths, I think was helpful. I got diagnosed and then started receiving academic intervention services at Lee Pesky with their educators. And then I also was found eligible for special education in the 1st grade. I had an IEP and I started getting small group reading instruction with my teachers at school as well. I know that I was getting evidence-based phonics instruction and getting activities in phonemic awareness and high rates of opportunities to respond and letter sound correspondence and phonics instruction. But at the time, I obviously didn't know any of that yet. And my main memories of the reading instruction I got at Lee Pesky was just that it was exhausting and that I was having to respond constantly and I was the only one in the room and it was one-on-one intensive instruction. And I remember just feeling exhausted leaving those sessions. I also remember feeling more successful at Lee Pesky in those intervention services than any other part of school. Because now what I know is that I was getting appropriate scaffolds and immediate error corrections. But as a kid, I just remember thinking, okay, I'm learning to read here.
Excellent. So I love that video by Julianne because it really is reminiscent of my boys sharing their thoughts with me as they were receiving interventions. Now, I already mentioned they're adults. My youngest is now a sophomore in college. So when we were doing this work, we were also at an independent tutoring center. We were at one of the children's dyslexia centers, and they would go twice a week. We would drive an hour. They would have an hour-long tutoring session and we would drive an hour home. And they each did that for 2 years between 3rd grade and 4th grade. And they were responsive and excited because they finally felt success and they were responding to the interventions and they recognized that they were responding. They felt that they were becoming readers. But that idea of it being exhausting and also, quite honestly, torturous, having to go for 3 hours, 2 afternoons a week when their friends were doing other things and they had missed opportunities for other fun after school activities. I really think that should give us all pause for understanding how vitally important it is to make sure that those evidence-based practices are happening in our schools. Because our children deserve access to those things just as their peers are getting access to reading instruction that may be working for them in the classroom. And just because you are signed on for an IEP, or for small group reading intervention work, it doesn't always mean that evidence-based practices are a part of that mix. I guarantee you nothing that is happening in her Lee Pesky Center or in the Children's Dyslexia Center where my boys were getting their instruction, there was nothing magic going on there. It was really good structured literacy, explicit phonics and phonemic awareness instruction, vocabulary work, sentence writing, spelling. It was just really good direct instruction with all of the things that Julianne talked about, right? Immediate corrective feedback, lots of opportunities to respond. These are absolutely things that we can be doing in our general education settings and in our intervention settings in our public schools. And the National Center for Improving Literacy is here to help you if you are looking for specific supports in bringing that type of evidence-based instruction into your settings. So now this timing worked out really beautifully. I'm here for a question and answer period. I'm looking at the chat and I don't see anything specifically, but maybe something came into you specifically, Julia, or would you like to type some questions into the chat now and we'll field them?
Yeah, I have not received anything yet, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to add them.
I think I have 3 things. One may be a question and maybe just 2 others. I do want to echo, Deborah, what you said is that we want to make sure that in school we're utilizing evidence-based practices, because I hear Julianne's story and the story of your sons. And thank goodness their extra work in reading outside of school paid off, but they did describe it as exhausting. It wasn't, and we just know that maybe not everyone has the opportunity to seek that instruction outside of the school day. So it is so important for us to really understand dyslexia and make sure our instruction within, in our school settings are meeting or serving kids, because not all of them are going to be going to outside sources to learn
Yeah.
to read.
Susan,
And I also thought about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to, I thank you so much for bringing that up. That's the equity piece.
Yep.
That absolutely is probably the top reason to be doing this work.
Yes. I also think too, I definitely I think had an understanding that dyslexia, there were some family factors that affected that. I did not know it was 50%, there's a 50% chance. And then I like that idea of just a simple screener question, but then I wonder too, if some parents even know if they have dyslexia or not. So again, it's a little bit of that equity issue. If you hadn't ever been formally diagnosed, you may not know. So now I'm getting to my question so that we can also get to Diane's question. Is there any research, because I understand that dyslexia, there's that continuum from mild to profound. I wonder if there any research that, that kind of give a percentage, or most kids, do you have more kids on the mild range or more on the profound, or maybe that research doesn't exist and I'm not even sure if it matters or not, but.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm well trained to say, I don't know when I don't know. So yeah, I'm not familiar. Nothing has ever crossed my path that caught my eye. But we could definitely pose that back to some of our experts at NCIL to see if there is research on that. One thing I do know that is when it comes to dyslexia or, a word level reading disability, it's really kind of the rule rather than the exception that there are probably other types of learning difficulties that are in the mix, right? So to just have a reading difficulty, oftentimes what you might find is those kids that present and they respond so quickly to intervention and there's no other kind of processing issues or anything going on. Oftentimes, I kind of get comfortable thinking about those more maybe as kids that might have been instructional casualties if we hadn't have intervened, that maybe there wasn't, a genetic component to what was happening for them. But when we are talking about kids that have that genetic component, I do know that researchers have kind of said that it's usually the rule that there's other stuff there too. So maybe there's a word finding deficit or some attentional factors that are coming into play, or working memory problems. And those are probably, when we're talking about the research literature showing a little bit lower prevalence rates, we're probably talking about kind of that population of kids that have like significant and profound deficits, and then these other types of issues and learning disabilities kind of coming into play in the mix. I wanted to comment on your very thoughtful analysis of like, you may not know, like, does dyslexia run in your family? So 15 years ago, I did not know. When I started this journey with my oldest son, I just knew he was having a struggle learning to read. I myself didn't even know the word dyslexia. Dr. Sally Shaywitz's book had just been published like that year, I think, or maybe a year prior. And it was through that kind of investigative work that the word dyslexia came into my realm. But I can tell you, I had a nephew that was in special education for reading disabilities, and two of my son's nephews had two of my son's uncles, he's their nephew. One never completed college because reading was too challenging, and another one has terrible spelling and handwriting to this day. And later, after my son was diagnosed with dyslexia, he came to realize, I think I'm dyslexic too. So you are absolutely right. Like, even, being very, very well informed about these things, like, we don't always know. So a lot of times I think the recommendation is to maybe you can pose that question, but you should also follow up with, were there any difficulties learning to read? Were there any behavioral problems that really impacted learning in the classroom? Did anyone drop out of school because of reading related difficulties? Like, you really want to have a good conversation about what that might be, because there's no guarantee that dyslexia is going to set it off for anyone.
Deborah, if we have time, I'd like to get to Diane's question in the chat, because I think that's a really great one about what red flags might we see with our multi-language learners in kindergarten or when they're in the early grades.
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably great to talk about it at the early grades, because the types of red flags that we might be looking for, we can look for them in the student's home language. So whatever language they're loved in and as a part of their, oral language background and in their family, looking for some of those phonological processing deficits that could be present in the home language. What makes it challenging is you have to remember students are coming to the classroom, and not only do they have to learn their oral language and then connect it to the orthography of their oral, language and into written language. So if they speak Spanish, understanding the Spanish word spellings, patterns, and things like that. But now they have to take what they have in Spanish, and they have to kind of think about that in English, and then make the connection to English orthography, English phonology connections. So we really need to make sure, before we're making any determinations if there's a disability in the mix, that number one, we are assessing for the red flags in the student's home language. And then also we have to make sure that we have good explicit instruction happening in English, understanding if they're doing a dual language program or not, and really be much more thoughtful about what is a language acquisition maybe hiccup, or what is a disability kind of issue that we're looking at. So seeking out assessment tools and screening tools that are specific for that population would be key.
Thanks, Tisha, for those extra resources that you posted in the chat. Deborah, I know you have a few more things to share with us, so maybe while we're kind of doing some tasks for you at the end, you can address any other questions that pop up in the chat by responding in the chat. Do you think that would work?
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, this is my last slide, and then I turned to you guys. So apparently in Virginia, you have a lot of dyslexia resources. So Julia is going to put into the chat some of the links of the things that you see here. There's a website, and there are some guidance documents that your department has put out. So please be sure to check those out. And be in touch with the National Center. Here we are on social media, and you can contact them at ncilliteracy@gmail.com. You guys?
Oh, yeah. Well, and we want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And if you're not already a member of our Virginia chapter of the Reading League, you can scan that QR code to join us. We'd love to have you. We also have a store if you'd like to share your Reading League pride. There, you can go to the store, and there's apparel there for purchase. We also want to share, while we have you, that we do have 2 more upcoming events, one in April and one in May, and I'll put those dates and the titles of those in the chats in just a second. But we have one coming up on April 22nd, and that's explicit instruction in language development. And, Deborah already talked a lot tonight about the importance of that explicit, direct instruction and skill. So this will be in oral language and language development. And then on May 21st, we're going to have a panel of different folks from across the Commonwealth who were part of the soft lunch for our VALS. That's our Virginia Assessment for Language and Literacy Screening System, because we know that in our Commonwealth we have a new screener that's coming out, and one of the purposes of that is to kind of look for some of those early red flags and risk factors for dyslexia. And we know there are a lot of people there are a lot of people across the Commonwealth that haven't had experience with that yet. So we're going to have a panel to be able to share some of the experiences and have some support from our Virginia literacy partners with that as well. So Jen, thanks for making sure the correct membership enrollment form is in there. Deborah, is there anything else that you have for us tonight
Yes,
before we officially close? Okay.
Yeah, this is very important. So the National Center is a federally funded comprehensive center. So getting feedback when we go out to do community events like this is very important to be able to sustain the work and have the opportunity to keep doing great work. So what would be wonderful is if everyone could scan this QR code and just complete this brief evaluation form so that we can collect your feedback and you really use that information to continue to do the work that we're doing and make improvements and become more effective. Thank you.
And Deborah, we want to thank you for spending time with us tonight and helping us have a better understanding of dyslexia. And we also want to thank you. Deborah's also a board member of the New Jersey chapter of the Reading League. So we love our Reading League connection. So it's so great. Again, we have 2 more upcoming events. It's so great to get to hear from we have some folks tonight that maybe haven't joined us for other events. So it's so fantastic. We look forward to, hopefully you're going to sign up to come. Our information regarding our April and May events will be coming out soon. So we look forward to having you come back and join us again. Deborah, again, thank you so much for tonight. Julia, thank you to you and the events committee as well. So we'll post the recording to our website in probably just a few upcoming days. So thank you for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.